Nisambula Vinaka, Mauri, Yakwe, Eko Mur Omo, Pakalofa Atu, hello, Maloi Lele, Malo Ni, and warm Pacific greetings to all. Welcome to the first such conference on the crisis of nuclear dumping in the Blue Pacific, a rather pressing issue on which Pacific youth and students are now taking a lead on. My name is Anit Kumar, and I will be a moderator for this event. Now, as we begin, I would like to sincerely thank our partners and sponsors for this conference, the RTT, or Reverse the Trend, Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, the Marshallese Educational Initiative, Sustainable Ocean Alliance, Pacific Hub, the University of the South Pacific Students Association, the Manhattan Project for a Nuclear-Free World, Climate Action Network Pacific, and Pacific Students Fighting Climate Change. I would now like to invite the founder of RTT, Reverse the Trend, Mr. Christian Tiavanu, who is also the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator at Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, to introduce what RTT entails. Christian, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Anit, so much. Before I introduce and in remarks, I just wanted to say that I'm just one of the coordinators of Reverse the Trend. The other coordinators are Danielle Samler of the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy and Lovely Umayam of Bam Shelto Policy Arts Collective. So, Reverse the Trend amplifies the voices of young people, primarily coming from frontline communities who have been directly impacted by nuclear weapons and climate change. The initiative embraces an interdisciplinary perspective on critical issues related to international peace and security and climate activism. We are thrilled that we are organizing Reverse the Trend chapters throughout the world, including in Canada, Japan, the Francophone region, and the Pacific, where young people can interact with one another. We're also in the process of establishing youth coordinators to help lead the process and to work with many young people. We work closely with numerous organizations, including the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, Bam Shelto, the UN Association of Fiji, the Marshallese Educational Initiative, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, Peace Boat US, Climate Cardinals, Zero Hour NYC, and many others. We are also very grateful that the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation serves as our fiscal sponsor. To ensure that we engage with frontline communities, we're in the process of requesting guidance and assistance from experienced activists who are involved with these communities, and you'll hear more about them from my colleague, Emma. So very briefly, how we engage with youth. We have a series of lesson plans, 28 lesson plans that touch upon nuclear weapons and climate change and the intersectionality of the two, as well as a toolkit that aims to educate and move youth in the service of fighting against nuclear weapons. And the toolkit highlights the intersectionality of these issues, as well as taking into account racism, the climate crisis, patriarchy, and draws attention to the underlying ideologies that keep nuclear weapons in place. And it's very important to provide educational background to young people. In addition, we also have a community forum where young people can exchange their views, engage with each other on important international issues, and strengthen the network of youth across the globe who are passionate about and interested in nuclear disarmament and climate activism. And very significantly, we also have this really great docu-series, which, to explore the role of art as an agent of change, we work very closely with Bam Shelto to bring a series of creative workshops for interested young participants. As a group, the young people have been engaging, youth have been engaging and sharing their concerns about climate change and radiation contamination from nuclear legacy sites into stories that bridge the scientific and historical evidence as well as personal stories. They've been working on creative writing and then soon collage and zine making. The first episode is centered on a group of Marshallese who are affiliated with MEI. It is based on a community poem they wrote called A Journey Home, and the poem can be found on the Outrider website, and we will share those links. So that's a very brief overview about Reverse the Trend. I would like to pass the floor back to Anit. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christian. Certainly amazing what partnerships, especially amongst young people, can deliver. Just like this conference, which was put together by the Pacific Youth Working Group Committee through our sponsors. And to talk more about partnerships, and as we heard from Christian, that the RTT is growing, I would now like to invite Emma Locher, who is the youth coordinator of RTT, to speak about the RTT's Pacific establishment. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Anit. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Ngarigo people, the traditional custodians of the land from which I am tuning in today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I am here to just provide a brief introduction to Reverse the Trend Pacific and our recently established youth committee. And then I will pass the mic to Manoa to elaborate. After commencing my internship with Reverse the Trend in February of this year, I immediately recognized the power of this initiative as an accessible platform for collective anti-nuclear activism, one that refocuses attention on the catastrophic effects of nuclear weapons through both highlighting the voices of youth and operating under the guidance of experienced activists who are directly engaged with frontline communities suffering from the interplay of nuclear weapons and climate change. In the Pacific context, two of our key advisors are Akmal Ali of the United Nations Association of Fiji and Benedict Kabua Madison of the Marshallese Educational Initiative. Considering that the toxic legacy of nuclear testing in the Pacific remains potent and that Pacific states are actively engaged in combating climate change, it is essential that youth have a platform to discuss contemporary regional issues that are threatening the viability of the region. One of the most recent challenges to arise being Japan's plan to release 1.25 million tons of contaminated seawater from the Fukushima nuclear power station into the Pacific Ocean. Upon hearing of Japan's decision, Christian and I consulted with Akmal Ali and Anit Kumar, seeking to establish the Reverse the Trend Pacific Youth Committee, who would mobilize action against Japan's decision. Because while this conversation has happened at the diplomatic level, we have been yet to see youth adequately represented in the discussion. Consequently, when youth are excluded, so are their insights and expertise. The committee is made up of 18 members from across the region who share a common vision for a nuclear-free Pacific. Over the past month or so, while planning this event, the committee has been innovative, creative, and they have dedicated so much time and effort to confronting such an intimidating and complex issue. Through this virtual process of many meetings, emails back and forth, and brainstorming on Reverse the Trend's community forum, as a youth committee, we have built personal connections, shared diverse perspectives and expertise, and here today, we witness the power of the committee's collective grassroots organization. After having seen the dedication, wisdom, and tenacity of each of the committee members, I have no doubt that the future of Reverse the Trend Pacific is bright. Thank you. Back to you, Anit.
Thank you, Emma. Now, as mentioned earlier on, partnerships amongst young people and cross-border collaboration amongst youth can create a huge impact on issues that we face today. And to speak about the aspirations of Reverse the Trend Pacific, I now invite Ratu Manoa Rokotavaga. Over to you, Ratu.
Thank you, Anit. Nisambula Vinaka and Pacific greetings, everybody. Before I commence, I'd like to acknowledge the indigenous and non-indigenous communities in Fiji and across the Pacific. I pay my respects to their giant elders and leaders whose shoulders I'm able to stand on today and move mountains. Becoming one of the members for Reverse the Trend Pacific Youth Committee was probably one of the greatest moments of my life. For some of us, this was the first time that we've joined a youth-oriented movement that seeks to address current issues that affect our Pacific region. I believe I echo the voices of my colleagues when I say that our love and deep attachment to our cultures, lands, and oceans are the fundamental pillars that drives us to become active agents in ensuring the protection and preservation of our cultures, lands, and ocean. The build-up to this conference involved a lot of commitment from all committee members. As Emma had mentioned, we had scheduled Zoom meetings where discussions were centered around the logistics and details of the conference. I should also mention that we were fortunate enough to have seasoned young people in our committee who also helped greatly in the preparation and promotion of this conference. Our team was sorted into subcommittees that oversaw a certain aspect of the conference. The various committees were the Programs Committee, the Outreach to Partners and Sponsors Committee, and the Media and Communications Committee, working together like a family, ensuring that we gave our 3,000% commitment to this conference. Because after all, we are one family, the Pacifica family. This brings me to the onus of my speech today. What will be Reverse the Trend Pacific's next step after this conference? When I think about the aspirations of RTT Pacific, I ask myself the question, how do I intend to use this platform to ensure that Pacific cultures, lands, oceans, and people are protected and above all, empowered? Three distinct points pop into my head. Number one, to inspire youth interest and participation. As a youth-oriented committee, it is our prerogative to include more youth voices into our space. The youth bring with them fresh new perspectives, an upbeat attitude, and unwavering support. I myself am part of a few youth organizations, and I can say that the inclusion of young people in the decision-making process has always yielded positive results. In our Pacific context, this is a reality that we should work towards. However, we do face a massive problem: the lack of interest shown by youth. It is no secret that the level of youth participation in civic matters is lacking. This lack of participation is largely attributed to the exclusion of young people from decision-making places, amongst other factors. Therefore, our first step must be to inspire and spark interest in our young people. Young people need to be interested and to believe in the goals that we are trying to achieve. For if young people were truly destined to move mountains, then it is our job to make them believe they can. Their belief will drive their engagement. The question then becomes, how do we make young people to believe? Well, that brings me to my second point. We must organize events like this that allow for meaningful youth participation. These events need to capture the very essence of the Talanoa spirit. For those who may not be familiar with this term, Talanoa is a traditional term used in Fiji and across the Pacific region to reflect a transparent, inclusive, and participatory discussion. The keywords being inclusive and participatory. This has always been our Pacific way when we center our discussions on Talanoa and sharing of ideas from everyone. Our committee will have to embody this principle. Aside from ensuring that these events are addressing relevant and critical issues impacting our region, it must also provide adequate education, skills, and tools that young people can use to spearhead change within their communities, country, and region. RTT Pacific will seek to provide this much needed education and skills to any interested young person. Our resource toolkit provides an online advocacy network, a docuseries, and resources, including a toolkit and curriculum that help educate and inspire youth to take actions against nuclear weapons and climate change. We hope to use these resources to impart valuable skills to young people with the hope that they can join us in our collective stance against nuclear weapons and climate change. Moreover, with the provision of education and skills, young people must also be given the opportunities to thrive. Young people are more likely to participate in any organization if they see other young people playing critical roles in that organization or even leading that organization. This idea of representation is so crucial because it empowers young people to aspire to leadership positions. Our Pacific Committee will center itself around this notion, the notion of centering voices of Pacific communities, particularly the youth, in global discourse regarding nuclear disarmament and climate change. Young people can be a positive force for Pacific development when provided with the knowledge and opportunities they need to thrive. The last point would be partnering with other youth-led organizations to raise awareness and mobilize collective action against current issues. As youth, it is vital that we explore the strong voices in our Pacific region. Voices that seek to mobilize local action, bring international light on Pacific issues, and holding foreign states accountable to their actions. In fact, our conference is proudly co-sponsored by these very strong voices, names of youth organizations that I'm sure all of us have some familiarity with. It is always encouraging to see young youth organizations partner with its sister groups to elevate their voices on the issues that matter. We need more of that. The more of us joining together, the stronger and louder our Pacific voice will be. We need unity in our diversity. Therefore, Reverse the Trend Pacific will bang the drums of unity and join with other groups in order to raise our voices in one tune. In order to show the world that we are united, we must first be united in our local and regional activism. I realize that I am nearing my time allotment. I'd like to leave a few points for reflection. Our world is experiencing newer and greater challenges. Our beloved Sea of Islands is not spared from these challenges. With these new and great challenges, we need a new and great generation of young leaders who aren't afraid to tackle these issues head on. These young leaders need to inspire youth participation. They need to be given the knowledge and opportunities to be able to navigate this vast ocean of challenges. Reverse the Trend Pacific seeks to be that vessel that ensures the smooth sailing of its leaders. We recognize that youth will be our arrows that take us into the future. We aspire to mold these young individuals to become the passionate, empathetic, and wise leaders they were always meant to be. The leaders who will join the individual voices and release the cry so great that the foundations of heaven and earth tremble. We cannot always build a future for our youth, but we can always build our youth for the future. And over to you, Anit.
Thank you so much, Ratu, for that, for those interesting points and insights on what Reverse the Trend Pacific and the Pacific Working Group Committee is all about. Now, turning towards our keynote speakers, it is my pleasure to invite His Excellency Ambassador Dr. Satyendra Prasad, who is the Fiji's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, to deliver a keynote address today. Over to you, Ambassador Prasad.
Good morning, and thank you very much, moderator, and all the sponsors of this event, and to folks in Fiji and across the Pacific. Very warm Pacific greetings to all of you from New York. I'm very honored indeed to make a few introductory remarks, and extremely honored to be invited to speak to such an energetic and forward-looking network of young Pacific Islanders. I congratulate you on the founding of the Reverse the Trend Pacific grouping. For the Reverse the Trend grouping generally, congratulate you for a great effort to bring international attention on the issues of nuclear disarmament and of nuclear weapons and nuclear contamination, not in the Pacific only, but across the globe. And thank you all who are joined up in this network for continuing to such forcefully bring international focus on this. Speaking to you from the UN, so in some of my remarks, I will be giving to you a bit of a global perspective of how and where the United Nations features in this. But first of all, to young people across the Pacific, when in 1985, the Rarotonga Treaty was agreed to by our leaders in the Pacific to prohibit nuclear weapons. It wasn't a different era, but perhaps the context was slightly different. At that time, we understood, we knew what the destructive force of nuclear weapons in Mururoa, in Kiribati, in Marshall Islands, and across the Pacific. That part was very well understood. The parts that were not understood and that are only now beginning to be understood is sea level rise was very poorly understood. Very few, and they were very specialized scholars who had a sense at that time of how sea level rise was already creeping on low-lying atoll islands already, and the science and data was beginning to kick in. Had we known what we know about the pace and the long-term trajectory of sea level rise, I am very certain and very convinced that the scope of the Rarotonga Treaty would have been even more substantive. It would have covered far more areas in more comprehensive ways. And we all know that nuclear weapons were not only tested in and across the Blue Pacific, but that the contamination has been stored. Some of these are leaking because of time and all of that, but as well because of sea level rise, coastal erosion, etc. These are things we have a better granular understanding of now. And so I hope your network will be able to bring a lot more force and much better science and much better understanding on this connection. The second is that in 1985, our elders knew about climate change. They were feeling climate change. They were talking to us about climate change. I don't think climate change was a word used very widely in the Pacific, perhaps restricted to a few university classes and things like that, but it was not broadly understood. So now we understand climate change and the science of climate change and the scope and breadth of climate change across the Pacific, across the world as well. Had we known what we know about climate change then, and even a small proportion of the scope and breadth of climate change and its long-term trajectories, I'm again equally sure that the scope and breadth of the Rarotonga Treaty would be much more extensive, and it would have covered a lot more of the basis, both as a protective and forward-looking instrument, as well as in the way in which it has already been designed. So these two thoughts I'm leaving with you, and you're not a network, and I hope that you can continue to bring a lot more focus on these two questions. And the third, and we all knew from time immemorial, and our elders and our ancestors knew that life for us across the Pacific is focused on the oceans, and oceans is at the center, and we are around the oceans. And oceans are at the heart of our livelihood, of our existence, of our identity, of our statehood, the way in which it formed, and of our interrelationships, including commerce and trade. And so that has been there from time immemorial. It has taken a while, and now we have arrived at I think a destination where what this means has broadly been crystallized. And now we have, for the developing Pacific Island states, as well as the Pacific Island Forum family, a sense of identity that is formed around the Blue Pacific. We have a sense of what the geographical boundaries of the Blue Pacific is. We have a very good understanding of what Blue Pacific means for us. And we have a very good understanding of our obligation and our responsibility to the Blue Pacific. I'm from Fiji. In Fiji, our commerce and our economy is almost absolutely dependent on tourism. Take tourism out, and the economy is more or less in doldrums, as it is today. Tourism is dependent on the sea. I don't think too many tourists come to Fiji for our mountains and forests. They do come, but by and large, the brand of tourism and the commerce that it carries, etc., is around sea and oceans and reefs, etc. And the same is more or less true of all of the Pacific. Our identity, our commerce, our well-being, our livelihood, our health is contingent on this thing that we are now calling the Blue Pacific. We understand our obligations to it. We have a sense of how international law, the frameworks of international law that the United Nations systems provide, the framework of laws that our national settings provide, oceans law and law of the sea as it is applied to our own countries, as well as environmental laws, environmental protection laws, and climate laws, etc. So we have a whole body of legal architecture at the global level, at national level, and at the regional level that gives color and form and protection and meaning to this thing called the Blue Pacific. And so to reverse the trend, my 2 or 3 challenges are to you is I think leaders across the Pacific will be very excited by the energy that you will bring to protecting the Blue Pacific. They will certainly welcome and look forward to how you can take the science that we know and so in our own understanding of the nuclear challenges across the Pacific, how short-term and long-term climate pressures, climate change trajectories impact on our nuclear settings, 1. 2, even more specifically, how sea level rise and warming oceans and the catastrophes that they create impact on the nuclear settings. And 3, why protecting the Blue Pacific from nuclear contamination and contamination of any type, including nuclear contamination and dumping of waste of any type and dumping of nuclear waste of any type is that making a very strong stand against that is so crucial to protecting and preserving our Blue Pacific identity, and that this is an obligation we all as citizens of the Pacific have taken to upon ourselves, and which I hope that the networks represented here today and Reverse the Trend grouping will take forward very seriously. So thank you very much for inviting me to give a few remarks. I really look forward to continuing this conversation with you, following your work, cheering you as you go. As a diplomat from Fiji and from the Pacific, we look forward to receiving submissions from you, on receiving guidance from you, and receiving wisdom from you on what we should be doing globally in the areas of international lawmaking to protect our Blue Pacific, for which we all are collective custodians and stewards. Thank you very much, moderator, and good morning again to everybody this morning.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Indeed, several things to note on from that address, Your Excellency, and we really hope that you can stay with us until the conclusion of this event, because we will have some interesting speakers coming up next, including our young people. Now, since the mode for the event is set for entirely the Pacific, It is with great excitement that I now invite His Excellency, Ambassador Teberu Sito. Ambassador Sito is Kiribati's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, an ambassador to the United States, an ambassador designate to Mexico and Canada. Without much further ado, the screen is yours, Ambassador Sito. Apologies, Your Excellency. I think you are still on mute.
Thank you, Ivanka. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this very, very interesting and very, very important event. Young people of the Pacific and their, friends outside the Pacific who believe in a peaceful and human caring world, a world without the threats of nuclear war, a human loving world. Yes, I am very excited, and I thank Ambassador Prasad for providing the opening remarks. I did prepare a speech, but after listening to Ambassador Prasad, I thought I'll put my speech down and concentrate on the excitement that is before us. Young people of the Pacific and around the world are working together to try and make things better for the world is a good idea. And especially given the threats that we now face, climate change, nuclear threats, violence, all sorts of threats we see around, humanitarian crisis all over the place. Now the Afghanistan crisis is before us, and each time we see images, we feel so sad. Can the world be a better place? That is always a question I have in mind. I was a young guy like you at some point. I was at the University of South Pacific. I was there with Ambassador Prasad. I'm a bit older than Ambassador Prasad anyway. But anyway, we were working as students of the university, trying to do something like you're trying to do now. So I encourage you, go on, keep on doing it, but be serious about it. Because the problem is, I see with many young people, and I've met many, including my colleagues who were young at the time, and we talked the same language when we were young. But as we grew older and we obtained positions, good positions, we became part of the elite, our language changed. Somehow we changed. Why? Why we're no longer pushing against something we believe is not right. We've, forgotten the good old values, the fundamental values, the good values of society that we grew up in, that make our society in the Pacific so pristine and nice and beautiful, and they're still beautiful, but these are going to go away soon if we don't hold on to them dear. We want the Pacific to be free of the nuclear dumping or anything that the big countries, big multinational corporations, people who are after the profit. Who doesn't want the profit? We all want profit. I have my own business in Kiribati. I try to make profit. But let's do it nicely. Let's do it clean. Let's have clean profit, clean money, clean ideas. Let's have a clean world full of clean things. And if we do that, it will be a much better world. And so I encourage you, young people. I know Ambassador Prasad has given you very good inspiration. I'm adding the words, the wise counsel of my good friend, Ambassador Prasad, and he's in a very good position to say what he has said. And he said to you, come on, tell us how we can support you here in the UN. I'm here working with Ambassador Prasad, who's at the chair now of the Well, currently the chair, we was recently the chair of the Pacific Island Developing States, PSIDS, which all the countries of the Pacific, excluding Australia and New Zealand. And now, just recently, because the Fiji is the chair of the Pacific Island Forum, he's now the chair of the Pacific Island Forum ambassadors here in New York. And so he is in the very good position to encourage you to challenge you to come up with ideas, good ideas that we can link onto, we can push them here. In view, there's so many, as Ambassador Prasad mentioned, there's so many channels here. They're all open, there are many doors here. But it's up to us to knock on those doors. And even sometimes push our way into those doors. We have to do it nicely and gently in the Pacific way. But sometimes when they're not listening to us, it's good we have a group of Pacific Islanders coming together and storming the door of the Secretary General or the President of the General Assembly, say, we want to discuss this. This is very important. Our young people in the Pacific out there, they want this. And we will certainly take your voice. Seriously. So I would, endorse what Ambassador Prasad has said. Keep moving, keep working at it. I would say be serious, because if you're not serious, you're not going to enjoy it. You must do it seriously. I'm a serious guy, so I'm telling you to be serious. And I was serious from young up to now. And I mean everything I say, I mean, and I go and do something about it. Walk the talk, they say. So keep talking, young people, we're with you. You're not alone. We are here. We know a bit more than what you know, but you're not great yet. You have a lot of energy. There's the that you can connect now with the social media. You can connect with the whole world, young people around the world, and try and mobilize things in a particular direction. Can you convince young people in the United States, in the UK, in Japan, to agree with the Pacific people that there should be no more of this nuclear weapon? Because it's going to be very difficult, I know. I talk with ambassadors here, and they're angry with me, ambassadors of and United States, UK, France. They say, you're not doing right by trying to eliminate nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are needed. We must be strong in our country, so we can be strong and negotiate on strength. They say, negotiate on strength means you negotiate with a nuclear bomb behind you. We don't trust each other, and we continue not to trust each other in the world. Can we change that? You young people, can you help shape a world where we trust each other more? Now, the Americans don't trust the Chinese, and the Chinese don't trust the Americans. The Russians don't trust the Americans, and vice versa. And so this is my point. I would not take more of your time. I don't want to accept, but I'm really excited. And I'm very happy to see young faces, so energetic, so full of passion and wanting to do something. Congratulations and all the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Indeed, the challenge is very well taken by me and my colleagues, and we will do our best to live up to the expectations that you and Ambassador Prasad both has highlighted to us. And those were really insightful, given your own experiences as a young person and then holding this diplomatic post. Thank you again, Your Excellency. Now, the South Pacific Nuclear Zone Free Treaty, or the Treaty of Rarotonga, as Ambassador Prasad stated, was adopted in 1985 and is regarded as one of the key regional security achievements in the Pacific, a contribution to global as well as regional nuclear non-proliferation. So what's the concern now? Now the situation is alarming, as Japan has approved a plan to release more than 1 million tons of contaminated water from the destroyed Fukushima nuclear plant into the Pacific Ocean. Yes, the blue Pacific Ocean, which is our common identity, our connection, and our pride. Moving deeper into this conversation, I now invite Dr. Ivanka Hughes, who is the director of K1 project at Center for Nuclear Studies at the Columbia University, to share with us about what else might be in the ocean. So here's a surprise for you. Over to you, Dr. Hughes.
Thank you so much, Anit, and thank you everyone for the invitation to participate in this event. I'm really here for two reasons. The first is that I'm incredibly and deeply passionate about the nuclear justice issue, as I am about education of young people. So this is actually absolutely my kind of a dream event where my two passions come together, and I get to see the young people getting both educated and excited about doing something on the issue of the nuclear legacy and nuclear justice. The second reason I'm here is that I can never say no to Christian. So if Christian asks me something, my answer is always yes. Don't tell him that, but that'll be our secret. But again, I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and thank you all for giving me some time to share my thoughts. I'm incredibly grateful for hearing from Ambassadors Prasad and Sito, and really humbled to be speaking right after them. I'm actually going to share my screen and show a few slides just as I talk a little bit about, as we become concerned and learn more about the plan for Japan to dump all of this radioactive water into the Pacific. It's important to note that this is not the first time that this is happening to the beautiful, beautiful ocean. Of course, what I'm referring to, and let me begin to share my screen and show you some slides. What I'm referring to, of course, is the legacy of the nuclear testing in the Pacific, and in particular, three countries, including my own country of the United States, as well as United Kingdom and France, tested very heavily in different parts of the Pacific. The United States focused, let me just move this, can you? Hold on, sorry, this was a little bit in my way. United States tested in a couple of different locations in the Marshall Islands. I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment. It also, in conjunction with the United Kingdom, tested in locations in the Republic of Kiribati, as well as in Johnston Atoll, which is currently under protection of the United States. And then the United Kingdom did test in multiple locations in Kiribati, and France tested on a couple of islands, Morora and Fangataufa in French Polynesia. I'm just going to say a couple of things about each of these locations, or a couple of chosen locations. For the Marshall Islands, what we're really talking about is 67 tests that were conducted between 1946 and 1958. And I just want to give you a sense for what we're talking about here when we talk about these 110 megatons of yield, energy yield for all of these tests combined. So when people talk about the power, the enormous power of nuclear weapons, they compare that power, that energy yield, to the amount of actual physical amount of the chemical explosive TNT that you would need to produce such an explosive power. And if you have, for example, a couple of tons of TNT, so 2 tons, which would be about 2,000 kilograms, or on the order of 4,000 pounds, for those of you who think in pounds, you could cause a tremendous amount of destruction. What we're now talking about is 110 megatons, so 110 million tons, or really 110 billion kilograms of TNT would have been needed to cause the energy yield of all of these tests combined. Another way to think about this is that this is the equivalent of about 7,300 Hiroshima bombs. So here we are in the Marshall Islands over a period of 12 years. What was actually used, what was actually tested, was the equivalent of over 7,000 Hiroshima bombs. And then when we move into Kiribati and what happened there, here what happened was over a shorter period of time, so just 5 years, 33 tests, so about half of the tests that were conducted in the Marshall Islands, and just under 1/3 of the energy yield. Again, this is about the equivalent of 2,000 Hiroshima bombs. So sometimes when people talk about, oh, well, Hiroshima is okay and people there are okay now, that was one bomb. Yes, of course, the tremendous death and destruction, all of that occurred when the attack happened. But what we're talking about in places like Kiribati is many, many, many more bombs being tested, much more energy yield over and over and over again. And then in French Polynesia, the number of tests was higher. Many of these were actually underground, but over 40 tests were, 46 tests were in the atmosphere. The French kind of have two things going there. One is lots of tests. Two is over a very long period of time and really into the 90s, you notice that the previous testing ended either in the late 50s or early 60s. So this is sort of incredible that this kind of testing went on as long as it did. The total energy yield was somewhat lower, but again, we're talking about the equivalent of almost 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. So whatever it was really the kinds of things that not only caused destruction at the time, but actually left radiation and fallout that is still there today. And I'm just going to speak a little tiny bit. I'm hoping to keep an eye on the clock, although I don't seem to have one on the screen right now. The kinds of things that we have been finding out about the Marshall Islands specifically. So over a period of over the last several years, since 2015, our center at Columbia University, my colleagues and students and I have been working on trying to understand the radiological conditions in the Marshall Islands. Going back to that map of the Marshall Islands, I had highlighted these atolls. Eniwetok and Bikini were used as actual testing sites, and Rongelap and Utrecht had populations living there at the time of the testing, and in particular, at the time of the infamous Bravo test, which had caused fallout that reached these populated atolls. And so we have been doing measurements that are telling us about the amount of radiation sort of in the air, something we refer to as background radiation. When you walk around an island, how much are you exposed to? We've been doing measurements and collecting samples and so on to ascertain the levels of radiation in the food, in the soil, and finally ocean sediment. And given our topic today, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a glimpse into some of those findings about the ocean sediment. And one of the places that we focused on was actually specifically the Castle Bravo crater. So the crater caused by the explosion of Castle Bravo, this singular explosion was the equivalent of about 1,000 Hiroshima bombs, so 15 megatons. Was the most powerful weapon that the United States ever tested. The Soviets ended up testing something even more powerful, but Castle Bravo was the most powerful test tested by the United States. We actually, this particular paper, we submitted about a year and a half ago. No, sorry, a little over 2 years ago. We actually had submitted a paper on the 65th anniversary of the Bravo test. So that was our way of acknowledging that legacy and that history. And here's just a map, and ignore for the moment these names. I'll tell you about them in a moment. But what you can see here is, if you know really nothing about atoll geography, and I'm hoping some of you do, this should look a little bit funny, right? It looks like something is missing here. It looks like there's a hole, and indeed there is, and it is a hole left by the Bravo bomb initially. And then, as if that hadn't been enough, the US ended up testing 6 other weapons in this same location. And the total combined energy yield of these tests was about 1/3 of the total combined energy yield of all of the tests in the Marshall Islands. So the US, so this one location was was sort of in a sense, you could think of it as the epicenter of the testing that took place in the Marshall Islands. And so we were really interested in kind of what the fallout, what the radiation levels look like in this crater. And this was actually technically a very challenging project, but it was something we were able to do. On this next slide, I'm showing you actually a map that we determined using sonar, using basically sound waves to figure out the depth of the crater. And it turns out that it's about at its deepest, it's about 50 meters deep, and this crater is filling in. So again, imagine there was an island here, a bomb exploded, it evaporated the island and created this crater. The crater is now filling in from the ocean at about a rate of about a meter every 3 years, so about a foot per year. But again, it was very challenging to get to these depths and have scuba divers who were trained. What was really interesting was that this area, and the divers dove at other locations in the Marshall Islands. This area was very different than anything else they had experienced in the Marshall Islands. It was very barren. There was the sediment was very kind of silty, very different from other places. And again, we're talking about 65 plus years since that time, and the impact is unavoidable. I'm not going to go into the details of the science, but just to sort of give you a sense that when we're talking about radiation, what we really mean is a number of different isotopes that may be present in the environment. And on the one hand, one could have hypothesized and really expected the levels of these isotopes would be high in this Bravo crater. On the other hand, this being the ocean, it wasn't clear. Did it all fill in? Did sort of things move around to such a degree that we wouldn't see levels or wouldn't see kind of measurable levels? We saw very high levels. And in fact, for some of the isotopes higher than anything we had found on the island, where that kind of land and soil measurements, obviously land kind of doesn't get perturbed as much as the ocean does. So I'll just say that as point number one. And point number two, when we're looking at these different isotopes, so we're talking about different isotopes of plutonium here, we're talking about cesium, americium, bismuth. What is happening is that some of these isotopes have what are called half-lives of about 30 years. So that means that they're slowly disappearing from the environment over time, and they'll be around for 150 years or so, but at some point they will mostly disappear. When we're talking about things like plutonium, especially plutonium-239, we're talking about many thousands. We're talking about 24,000 years for a half-life, and on the order of 150,000 years plus for these isotopes to continue to be present in the environment. I would be remiss talking about the Pacific and radiation and the nuclear legacy if I didn't just mention the Runit Dome. So Runit Dome is located on the island of Runit in Enewetak Atoll. Enewetak, as I mentioned at one point, was used as a testing site in the Marshall Islands. And then from 1978 to 1980, the United States cleaned up parts of Enewetak Atoll, actually not the entire atoll, and then stored some, not all, but some of the waste inside a crater, and then built a dome on top of the crater, a concrete dome. Of course, we're hearing about, we've heard a lot about the intersection between climate change or global warming, sea level rise, and the nuclear legacy. And this really is, this picture really is sort of the kind of picture you should keep in mind, where this nuclear waste sits, in a low-lying island, vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surges and so on, that will be a consequence and are already a consequence of climate change. Just gonna say one last thing. I recently published an article with a colleague and a student about the US with a proposal for the Biden administration to apologize to the Marshall Islands for the nuclear tests. And I really believe that these kinds of actions where these discussions are taking place and the young people are really standing up for what happened in their countries and how we can make the world a better place are sorely needed. And again, I'm delighted to be speaking to all of you and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hughes. That was really interesting, and science is, I think, just like Ambassador Prasad stated, that at that time when climate change was happening, we didn't have much science. We knew it was happening, but we didn't have much data. Now we have the science, and only if we had more time today to speak about that, that will be certainly interesting. But we have to move on, and then we'll continue such dialogues later on. I'm now delighted to invite Marie Inyo, who is the co-founder of the Manhattan Project for a Nuclear-Free World, to share the Japanese activist perspectives. Over to you, Marie.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to the organizers, coordinators, participants. I'm very honored to be here today. And before I share my presentation, I'd like to share the video message from Gensuikin, which is one of the oldest and largest anti-nuclear and peace organization in Japan.
世界各地で原子力発電に反対して行動している皆さん、こんにちは。私は核と人類は共存できないとの言葉に結集して核兵器廃絶と脱原発に取り組んでいる原水爆禁止日本国民会議副議長の藤本康内です。私たち原水金はさようなら原発1000万人アクションの運動の事務局も担っています。2011年3月11日の東日本大震災、そして福島第一原発事故から10年が経過します。被災者の方々には生活再建への長い道のりだったと思います。しかし、いまだふるさとに帰ることができず、道半ばの方々もたくさんいることを私たちは忘れてはなりません。この間、福島第一原発のサイトでは、日夜危険な作業をいとわず、事故の収束、廃炉に向けて多くの方々が努力をしています。しかし、溶融した核燃料デブリの取り出しどころか、その姿さえつかめていないのが現状です。原子炉建屋内で最大5150ミリシーベルト、格納容器内では42シーベルトといった人間が瞬時に死亡するような高い放射線量に拒まれ、当初40年を予定するとされていた廃炉作業は全く先の見通しが立っていません。このままでは100年、200年といった膨大な時間が必要になってくるのではないかと考えられています。溶融した核燃料は再臨界の可能性があり、冷却していく必要があります。その冷却水や建屋内に流入する地下水などは放射性物質に汚染され、高い放射線量を記録します。アルプスと呼ばれる多角種除去設備で 放射性物質を除去していますが、完全ではありません。ヨウ素、ルテニウム、ストロンチウムなど、多くが残っている場合があります。トリチウムは除去できません。現在、1044基ものタンクの中に123万立方メートルという膨大な汚染水が貯蔵されています。今、日本政府はこの膨大な汚染水を太平洋に投棄しようとしています。原水金は地元福島の仲間と共にこの汚染水の海洋投棄に強く反対し行動しています。日本政府、東京電力は最初から海洋投棄ありきでタンク設備場所のさらなる確保や他埋設方法の検討など別の対策を真剣に検討したようには思いません。そもそも東京電力は地元の了解なくして海洋投棄は行わないと約束していました。地元の漁業者も強く反対しています。海洋環境汚染防止のための国際海洋条約にも違反する可能性が高く、その毒性がしっかりと解明できていないトリチウムを海洋に投棄することは決して許されないと考えています。これまで幾度となく政府、東京電力との交渉、協議を重ねてきました。今後も全国から声を上げ続け、決して海洋投棄を許さずに脱原発に向けて頑張っていきたいと思います。皆さんにお話できたことを大変嬉しく思っています。ありがとうございました。
Right. I would like to share my presentation. Great. Thank you so much. Once again, my name is Mari Inoue of the Manhattan Project for a Nuclear-Free World, which is a volunteer-led grassroots group started in New York City 1 year after the Fukushima disaster. We organize educational events, collaborate with groups here in the US as well as in Japan. And also we educate policymakers and elected officials to promote peace and nuclear-free policies. We have YouTube channels and we post nuclear issues, including testimonies of those affected by the ongoing Fukushima nuclear disaster. We also have video messages from radiation measurement groups in Japan. They started measuring air, background radiation, soil, water, food after the Fukushima disaster because the government didn't provide enough information to them. So Japan has a long history of downplaying the effects of radiation exposure, which started soon after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It continued even after the US occupation ended in 1952, especially after the Castle Bravo test in 1954, when the nuclear testing in the Pacific ignited anti-nuclear movements in Japan. And the US-Japan agreement intentionally ignored many of the fishing crew members of many fishing boats that were affected by the radioactive fallouts from the nuclear testing. That kind of downplaying the effects of radioactive fallouts continued even after the Fukushima disaster so that Japan could host Tokyo Olympics, even though nuclear reactors are still in a state of emergency. In regard to the contaminated water stored in the Fukushima Daiichi site, the IAEA, International Atomic Energy agency conducted assessment recently and published a review report in April last year. And they acknowledged that there's no technology or solution to separate tritium. Also, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, which is one of the decision makers of this issue, acknowledging their PowerPoint presentation in March this year, saying that tritium and carbon-14, which is a radioactive form of carbon, cannot be removed from the through the ALPS filtering system. And the concentration of tritium in the water stored in the tanks could go up to 2.5 million becquerels per liter, which is extremely high. And Japan is planning to dilute them and dump into the ocean. So soon after Japan announced its plan to dump contaminated water into the Pacific, both the United States and the IAEA expressed their support. On the other hand, 3 independent human rights experts appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council expressed deep regret, saying that such dumping could impose considerable risks to the full enjoyment of human rights of concerned populations in and beyond the borders of Japan, unquote. And interestingly, almost 6 weeks after the announcement of the decision, TEPCO, the owner of the crippled power plant, openly, publicly published this open call for tritium separation technology, which is something that they should have been doing years ago, because they had this issue with tritium for a long time. So in June this year, we submitted a letter endorsed by 70 US groups to METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan through Japanese consulate in New York City. We asked them to share our concerns with ministers of those agencies. We raised concerns about the long-term impacts on the wide Pacific region. And also we talked to the consul of the Japanese consulate early this month, and he said that Japanese government consulted with scientists and concluded that contaminated water, radioactive water, is safe to the ocean, but we disagree. And Gensuikin, the one that you have just seen, they have been doing meetings with MEDI and also MOFA. And recently they had a meeting last month, and they were told by Ministry of Foreign Affairs that releasing contaminated water from exhaust pipes or pipelines will not be considered ocean dumping under the London Protocol. London Protocol is one of the international treaties to protect marine environments. So it seems like they believe that they're not violating international law and continue to stick with the plan. So we are going to organize Protect Our Ocean Rally and March in New York City on October 2nd. And we are inviting other groups in other cities to organize a similar action, virtually or in-person action in your city. And if your group is interested in organizing one, please reach out to us so that perhaps we can share some strategies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marie. Certainly amazing, and the momentum that you have created with some of the interesting work that you have shared that you do there in New York. To continue this momentum, I now invite Mr. Akmal Ali from Fiji to share his reflections as a Pacific activist. Over to you, Akmal.
Nisambula Vinaka, everybody. Greetings, Yakwai, Yorana, and Maori, to everybody. Thank you very much, Anita. This is, in fact, this has been a excellent conference where everybody has, I think, spoken immensely. And in terms of reflection, I think right now when we are talking about the Japanese trying to dump their nuclear waste into the Pacific Ocean, and they somewhat are getting success to this, we need to also remember that it is not only the Japanese. I think the one of the speakers had highlighted about the Rinit Island, and the a few fact about that crater or that dome is that it is 328-foot crater that remained from one of the 1958 explosions. And for 3 years, the American military had dumped nuclear waste into it. And some 6 men had also died during this work. And just to put some perspectives or data to it, from I think in the beginning in 1977, the US collected around 73,000 cubic meters or 2.58 million cubic meters of tainted soil across the islands and actually dumped it in Runit. Now, this dome, as per very reliable sources, is now cracked. One of my most reliable sources is the current nuclear commissioners of Marshall Islands, Elson Cullen, who is also a very good colleague, civil society colleague. When you go to the Marshall Islands, you know that there is something wrong. Why there is something wrong? The biggest side effects of this nuclear test that's happening, and people would not know about it, is women giving birth to jelly bean babies, if you'd like to call that, kids born without any bones. And sometimes, and they will only live for 1 or 2 days. And there is a lot of deformities. I mean, if you go to the Northern Pacific countries, whether it's the Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, if you go to Guam, to the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, to the to Palau, the biggest, the largest, I think, in 2018 for my work, I was based in Guam for about 6 months, and I was traveling around the Northern Pacific and working with civil society there. And the cause of death that I've never had that much or that many in Fiji or the South Pacific, it was I was really baffled because the types of cancers people would get, it would be mind-boggling. I mean, I met this lady. At one stage, she had breast cancer. She goes and does her chemo. She comes back. She lives her life. 2 years later, she breaks her leg. She goes back to the hospital and she is diagnosed with bone cancer and hip cancer. I mean, can you imagine one person suffering from 3 different types of cancers? And this is just one of the many. And there are numerous people, but because they have some kind of free association and they do get to access medical facilities, but not everyone can do that. Not everyone can afford that. Not everyone can reach to these.
What's that?
To these
Yes.
Sorry? I'm sorry, did somebody say something? Okay, so what we need to do, my reflection as an activist from the Pacific in terms of Marshall Islands and the realities, we've got data, we are all very active, we know what to do. As Pacific Islanders, we have been talking about taking actions, and we are taking actions, whether it's climate change, whether it's this current issue, and all the atrocities we have faced. But the cause of all of these has, from the beginning, been nationalism. Nationalism of the French, nationalism of the Americans, nationalism of the British, and their colonialistic mentality that when they come in, and I mean no offense, but the white savior complex needs to end, and it needs to end now. And this is more amplified by Hollywood, which only tells stories. If another country is in a lot of trouble, it's only people from the United States or people who are fair skins or Caucasians who can give us solutions. I mean, Afghanistan is the biggest blunder of the United States. But come next year or after next year, I bet you there will be a movie and there will be some American trying to save the day. They will never admit, they have never admitted Vietnam. They are not admitting the mistakes and the atrocities they have caused to the people of the Pacific, and to us. Right now, we, the rest of the world, we are in sympathy and have been in solidarity after Nagasaki and Hiroshima with Japan. But what Japan is doing, is it really being fair to the rest of the world? When the rest of the world stood in solidarity, and now they're trying to dump their nuclear waste into our oceans. And ladies and gentlemen, if you're not from the Pacific, you must know that to the Pacific, the ocean is not only water, it is our mother. It is where life comes from. It is a blood that connects the people of the Pacific, and we are united by this one ocean. You pollute this ocean, you are affecting every individual who lives in the Pacific Ocean, whether you're from the north, you're from the south. Now we can talk about many remedies for that. But one of the best ways that we can suggest as a solution to our Western counterparts is by promoting global citizenship education, SDG 4.7, and the importance of multilateralism. Right now, if we look at it in countries, the biggest problem that we are facing is patriotic nationalism to the extent of extremism is being preached in countries where the narrative is us and them, where us is the hero and them are either the victims or the villains. So we need to promote global citizenship education, and when history is taught, it should not be, and at no stage in any way should be biased history, where because I'm the greatest country in the world, such as the United States that claims, they must also acknowledge by becoming this greatest country, which they teach in their history, that was at the cost of the people of the Pacific, for example, when they became the biggest superpower in terms of their nuclear legacy. This fact is never taught in any American schools. If you go to the southern states or anywhere in the United States to the 50 states, even if you go to the Hawaii, I'm grateful to our indigenous Hawaiians who are now raising awareness in our Pacific Island communities. But then again, in the mainstream school systems, this kind of history is not taught. When this is not taught, then there is no sense of responsibility. In the Pacific, we talk about it. I mean, let's not even go to the United States. Let's talk about some of the things that we have heard today from Dr. Ivana, from Marie, from our speakers, Dr. Prasad, Ambassador Sito. A lot of these things, to some of us, we've heard it for the first time. Why? Because it is not incorporated into our education system. We need to promote global citizenship education, create global classrooms, a sense of responsibility as global citizens. At USP, when I was there, and this was many, many years ago, we pushed for a particular course at the 200 level, a generic course called Pacific Worlds. And the main purpose of this course was to promote such type of Pacific issues so that anybody who's a graduate of the university can actually go through this. But I don't know, and I don't know if enough has been covered by this particular course. But that is what we need to do. We need to set up a mindset. We need to be able to take an extra mile, to be able to learn, to be able to start. I mean, we have so many members of our young teenagers who want to be part of this, and social media is taking on. So rather than making self-entitled or narcissistic TikTok videos, we need to come up with TikTok videos or social media awareness with this kind of reality, such as, did you know that the Rennet Dome is now being broken and we are at risk? This is not happening. Now, the last part, engaging with youth. I have been working with youth I mean, I was a youth not long ago, you know, some 6-7 years ago, 5 years ago, I was counted as a youth. However, the biggest problem that we have right now is of that of entitlement. That we feel entitled just because we are a particular group or a particular group of people, or we come from a particular race or color or creed, we are entitled. That is not, that will never help us in doing what we are doing right now. We need a sense of responsibility. And as Ambassador Soti said, when we do this, we need to get serious. We need to be committed. We need to live it by our words, thoughts, and deeds. Then and only then we will be able to bring in real change. We need to bring in ethical engagement. Now we have so many people around, even in our in many of the sectors. When you go to global meetings, most of the time you don't even see them in the meetings which they are supposed to attend. They will be out there shopping. A sense of responsibility, ladies and gentlemen. So if I had to summarize as in terms of my reflection as a Pacific activist for the last 21 years of my life, I would say, if we need to get things rolling and moving, we need to promote global citizenship education and the importance of multilateralism. We need to get out from the selfish and biased nature of nationalism, but get into the context of more regionalism. For example, in the Pacific, we need to act local, feel regional, and think global. Or we can turn it around. But howsoever it is, we need to come together as people of the Pacific first. We need to put our differences. And anyway, the Pacific is a family. In every family, there are people, there are relatives who will disagree too. But when we come to activities and events of common good, for example, a marriage, a funeral, or a birthday celebration, we all come back. And maybe perhaps we won't like this particular auntie, but that auntie will still be in the room and part of the conversation. So as Pacific Islanders, we need to do that. We need regional solidarity. We need global citizenship education. We need multilateralism. And in terms of youth engagement, we need committed and responsible engagement. And from the older generation, we need your commitment and respect for the youth, so that there is a mutual understanding between the parties, so that the senior can mentor and train, and then and also acknowledge that not one sector of people can take the space. Everybody has to come together and work together. It is not giving priority to one sector. With that, ladies and gentlemen, and I would like to also acknowledge the presence of our two permanent representatives for the Pacific Island countries, Excellency Dr. Prasad and Excellency Mr. Sito. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your time, and thank you all for listening to me.
Thank you, Akmal, for those insights and your experience sharing with us. And to continue this sharing of experience, we are now turning to our final speaker. Don't leave yet. We have an interesting part left. That's the Q&A where you can engage directly with the speakers. So to continue the momentum of sharing perspectives, I now invite Marisha Jones from the University of the South Pacific to share a youth perspective regarding Japan's decision to discharge decontaminated water in our ocean. Marisha, over to you.
Thank you, Anit. To our speakers here today, His Excellency, Honorable Sito, Honorable Dr. Prasad, Dr. Hughes, Madame Inoue, Sir Akmal Ali, our sponsors, the RTT Organizing Committee, and to everyone here today, Iyang Okasalelia Mango. I come from the beautiful island of Pohnpei in the Federated States of Micronesia. I am humbled to have been given this opportunity to be the voice of the youth and address this respected forum. As mentioned, the aim of Reverse the Trend, or RTT, is to empower the youth to advocate against nuclear testing and waste disposal and climate change. That is why I am here today. I recently joined RTT because I believe that the Pacific Islanders have the right to be consulted on the matter regarding Japan's decision to release nuclear treated wastewater into the Pacific Ocean. As young Pacific Islanders, we fear for the loss of our past. The Pacific Islands are all connected by our ocean. It has always sustained us, and we have relied on it for food, tradition, transportation, and economic development. Not only do our islands rely on revenues derived from fishing as a source of income, we also view our ocean as a sense of cultural identity. Our ancestors have been navigating our waters for years. Even with the tourism economy, we are still bound to our ocean. Japan has decided to release 1.25 million tons of diluted, yet nonetheless contaminated radioactive water. This has potential to have detrimental impacts to the ocean, its biodiversity, and the communities that depend on it for their livelihoods. When I first heard of this decision, my first thoughts were on the effects this decision would have on our marine environment and its resources. I feared that our future generations will no longer be able to connect to the oceans the way that we and the generations before us have. This decision may end years of traditional practices to protect and preserve our marine environment. Our Pacific leaders have expressed their concerns on Japan's intentions, and we, the Pacific people, share those concerns. The potential impacts will affect the Pacific region as a whole, and that is why it is vital to encourage more of the Pacific communities to come together and be involved in this discussion. Furthermore, we fear for our present. We are currently paying the price for what has been done by other countries with regards to generational impacts of nuclear testing, the rising of sea level, particularly on our small island nations. For this reason, our people have long fought the fight for environmental protection and conservation. As we are the frontline communities vulnerable to the negative effects of climate change, we have long urged leaders of industrialized countries to fulfill their international obligations for the protection and sustainability of our homeland. The release of radioactive water alone could undo all the hard work and dedication that our people have invested in protecting our environment. Nuclear technology has had devastating impacts on the Pacific region, as we have discussed today. Our islands and oceans were testing ground for the international community's nuclear weapons. This has left entire islands, atolls, uninhabitable, displaced entire community, and has had lasting negative effects on the environment and public health. We recognize the struggles of our Pacific neighbors in the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, and French Polynesia, who have faced or are currently facing the generational impacts of the nuclear testing era. As an example, the Bikini Atoll, as we have discussed in the Marshall Islands, still remains uninhabitable to this day. We hope that by continuing to raise awareness and advocate against the toxic nuclear legacy, we can prevent any further transboundary harm to our Pacific peoples. Finally, we are worried about our future. With this conference, we hope to bring about any alternatives or solution to this horrifying decision. There must be other ways to properly dispose of the radioactive water without jeopardizing our Pacific Ocean. We currently do not know for sure how our ocean will react to this significant amount of radioactive waste. We can guess it, we can predict it, but we don't have enough data to confirm these predictions. We want numbers, we want evidence. We do not want empty reassurances. We want to be completely satisfied that there will be no devastating outcomes on our shared ocean before this decision progresses. So we ask on behalf of the youth that if there is no other way, then there must be at least clear and accurate research be made available to all in the Pacific so that they may be able to make an informed decision on whether to oppose or consent to Japan's decision. As we are the people who will continue to rely on the ocean at stake, it is important that our voices be heard. I want to end by further encouraging our Pacific youth to be involved in our cause. You do not need any prior experience or expertise to advocate against climate change and nuclear testing. If you are a Pacific Islander with genuine concern for the safety and security of your homeland, you can speak up on issues that you see have potential in causing adverse effects in your communities. Encourage those around you to be involved. We as Pacific youth have the moral obligation to speak up on matters that have the potential to adversely affect our communities and homeland. We must continue to hold our leaders accountable in their responses to these issues. We must also continue to use our collective voices to tell our stories. We cannot be idle and watch our homes and our Blue Pacific be destroyed. Thank you all once again for this opportunity, and I do hope to work alongside you in this movement to protect our ocean. Thank you and galangan. Over to you, Annie.
Thank you, Arisha. Absolutely relevant and timely messages and perspectives shared by all our speakers today. And we certainly need to keep this momentum and dialogue happening if we are to protect and preserve our Blue Pacific Ocean. I now invite attendees to interact with us via the Q&A function. You can chat in the chat box, put in your questions there. And please feel free to ask these questions to our speakers. We will take these questions forward. Currently, I haven't received any questions in the chat box. I'm just going to check with my colleagues Emma and Christian if they have received any questions.
Can I just ask a question openly? Now, Akmal Ali had spoken about all these wonderful, passionate things, but one of the things that I hadn't yet to hear from him are what are some of the things that he is currently actioning within Fiji, for example, because it's one thing to talk, it's another thing to act. And I say that respectfully, because there are many of us out there. And second thing too is I hear we keep calling ourselves Pacific Islanders. Yes, we come from the ocean of islands, but I also would like to remind each of us that we too are an ocean of nations, and we've fought the right for that. And this is a change of mindset continuously that others perpetuate the islander mentality. Stop. You know, there is a reason why we've become and we've fought for independence in our independent nations. Between each of us, yes, we are islanders, but in the face of global thinking, we are also nations. Malo.
Thank you very much, Fafetai. So I would like to respond, Anit, if it's okay.
Sure.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your wonderful question. In fact, the point of my contribution was not to challenge the sovereignty of our island nations. Of course, we have to acknowledge that each of our Pacific Island countries stand on a unique foundation with culture, custom, traditions, and its people, its values. So we're not ever going to disrespect that. But what we are saying is, when we need to come in front of the world, we need to come in one solidarity, and as people of the Pacific, because remember, together, I mean, as a single, we might not have ability to do anything, but as a feast, we can break walls together. So that was my point. My second point, and thank you for bringing something in terms in questioning of what I do in regards to the global citizenship education. I am the president of the United Nations Association of Fiji, and our organization currently is one of the few organizations that has received, that has no donors or funding. It is purely run on volunteerism, and people give their time. And very shortly, we will be launching our website. And I just wanted to acknowledge for your support in having built UNA Association, our website. But our main programmatic area at UNA Fiji is our diplomacy training programs. And in our diplomacy training programs, in global setting, in global classroom settings, we teach this. We bring in locals and try to have in trying to make us all, so we think local, feel regional, and act global. So we have been successful, and we have been quite successful so far under our program. Around 250 to 300 people have graduated from this program. And we are planning to really roll this out around the region. But this is only from 2016, since we rolled this program out. And this year we had 45 students, and this is not limited to any age category. This is anyone who's over the age of 15 to you could be 60 years old. It's open to anyone. So before we went into lockdown, we had finished our 7th class. And our classes are usually run by diplomats, expert trainees. So this year, we've had the American ambassador, we have had the British High Commissioner, we have had the Marshall Islands ambassador, we've had peace building experts, we have had negotiation experts coming in, and they give their time. And just for your information, the training does not require you to pay thousands and thousands of dollars of fee. It is for high school students, they pay about, if I'm not wrong, I think $30 Fijian for the whole training of 18 weeks. It's 18 Saturdays at 7 hours, around 80 hours, 84 hours of class that anybody has to attend at the basic level. We have then the intermediate level, and then we have the senior level. And we also partner with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Fiji. We have been able to see a lot of changes in the little group of people that I've been able to work with. I could very happily report to you that I've seen some positive changes. And I'd be very happy to talk to to you, ma'am, Leota. Are you from Samoa? I mean, if we can talk and maybe,
I'm sorry, my brother,
there.
you need to stop, because I'm sorry, but right now I'm finding it really hard, given the fact that with Fiji's political, status at the moment. But yes, you and I can go offline, and I'd love to give the opportunity to others to actually talk about what it is that you do, and also coming up with solutions. Marie, I loved your talk in terms of bringing forward what it is that your group is doing, especially in face of Japan. And with the statement coming out, and also Marisha, it's always beautiful to be able to hear not only a young academic like yourself coming, speaking, but being able to hear the reo, or the language of your people, being spoken as well. And so, and seeing that. And so those are the kind of things that I'm also really looking forward to helping to expand. My current role at the moment is writing up these policies and things here, and I'm based at the moment in Auckland, New Zealand. And as you may have witnessed, we've just had an apology by the local, by the Parliament. The government of New Zealand has formally apologized to the Pacific people of New Zealand for the atrocities that we faced during a time, dawn raids, during a time when they wanted to push us out of New Zealand after inviting us here. So that's enough from me, and I hand it back to you. But questions, I'm looking forward to it. Keen to hear.
Naka.
Thank you, Akmal and Leotha. We do have a lot of questions coming in. I've received a lot of questions. This question is posed to Dr. Hughes. Dr. Hughes, there's a participant from Solomon Islands, a young person, asking you about if you can explain very briefly on what the current science says should the contaminated water be in the ocean. Will it affect our fisheries resources? Will it affect our marine resources?
That's an excellent question, and I think I'm not aware of the scientific consensus or exactly the data that the Japanese government is saying they consulted when making this decision. The conversation I'm hearing is about the levels of tritium, which is just one of the isotopes that could be present in this radioactive waste, however diluted it is. The biggest concerns would be the kinds of isotopes that not only would be present in the water, but would then get incorporated into biological tissues. That is primarily something like Cesium-137. When I was showing you some data from the Marshall Islands, we have found in the Marshall Islands, Cesium-137 present not just in the ocean sediment and soil, but also actually in the food in the Marshall Islands, in the staples, in coconuts, pandanus, breadfruit. The levels are there and it's very clear. We actually looked at, again, if you'll remember that map I showed, so Eniwetok, Bikini, Rongelap, Utrecht. Bikini is where we found the highest levels of radiation in the food, in the coconuts in particular. And then Utrecht, which is about 300 miles from Bikini, we no longer even see the signal for that Cesium-137. Cesium-137, essentially, like you might know, for example, that you get potassium from bananas, right? So potassium and cesium are very similar chemically, and that's why the cesium that might be in the soil gets taken up by the plants, because the plants confuse the cesium for potassium and just take it up. And then if you actually eat something that has this radioactive isotope, that's very, very dangerous. When we did investigations in the Marshall Islands, we actually made measurements on I'm hearing some noise. Perhaps there is a way to mute somebody. We made measurements on the order of 100 to 200 fruits. You know, I'll just give for the moment, just give a little bit of credit to Japan in the aftermath of the Fukushima accident. They actually, at one point I was looking at the spreadsheets and they had done measurements on 1 million food items, million pieces of various food items to check for the Cesium-137, and had done a lot of work to sort of reduce those levels. But again, where did that waste go? And obviously the concern here is real, whether some of that cesium and then other isotopes as well. Strontium-90, we actually have a paper that was just accepted about strontium-90 levels. Strontium-90 was very much of a concern in the aftermath of Chernobyl. And we found that when the US government has been looking at levels in the Marshall Islands for a long time, they were sort of ignoring strontium-90. And our initial results suggest that strontium-90 is still very much present in the environment. That's something we'd like to pursue further. But again, I'm not standing here with data and information. I'm just trying to share that, you know, I believe the concerns are real, and I don't believe that when the response is, oh, it's just tritium, and tritium is just an isotope that's even naturally found in water. I don't believe that those are adequate responses. I think, you know, if exact levels of all of the different isotopes, in particular the ones that could be taken up by biological tissues, are shared, that would be a much better starting point for discussion. I hope that was useful.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes. I can see that there's a number of questions coming up regarding the science. But surely, as Marisha has shared, as Emma has shared, the RTT Pacific branch will continue such discussions, and we will try and bring data and science independently on future such dialogues, very near future such dialogues, where we can discuss these more openly. Just to note, both our ambassadors, His Excellency Dr. Prasad and His Excellency Sito, they have left. I think it's around 11 p.m. in New York. But of course, those questions that have been posed to the ambassadors, we will surely take those up, and we will try and get back to you. Oh, Ambassador Tito is here. All right. Thank you for being here, Ambassador Tito. Let me just read the question. The question was, Ambassador Tito, do you believe that, and this is from Vanuatu youths, do you believe that the nuclear crisis issue or the dumping of the nuclear contaminated water is an issue that can be taken to the UN Security Council?
Yes, it can be. I'm sure why we cannot take it. Of course, those who are members of the Security Council from our region, we don't have any from the Pacific now. We've got our friends in the Asia region who are members of the Security Council. And yes, any issue, basically any issue of concern to humanity, whichever part of the world it is, which is a security issue. Normally, security is defined as sort of to do with war and conflicts, but nowadays, of course, we see climate change, the nuclear, the pollution, the contamination, the poisoning of the environment, which is part of our livelihood. It is becoming a security issue. So my answer to that is yes. It can be taken to the Security Council, but then it really depends on those who will be carrying the issue on our behalf. We can make a point, we can talk here in the Pacific as a group of ambassadors. We can talk about it and then approach some of our partners from Asia or Europe. And we've got a good relationship as a group, as a Pacific group. We have a good relationship, and we can always tap on the goodwill and friendship of people in other regions who happen to be in the Security Council. I hope that helps.
Thank you, thank you, Excellency. That does help answer the question. There are a lot of questions coming in. We have around 10 minutes left, so I'll try and do that in order. There are some similar thematic questions, so I'll frame them in one. And Ambassador Sito, maybe this question came directed to you, is that there's a question posed that around Japan's time frame before the release. So we have about 18 months left to do anything or something regarding the decision or the timeline that Japan has put. So what can we do as a collective region? What can we do to slow that clock, that time frame down that Japan has put in place to ensure that we are able to do something about it? How can we delay the timeline that Japan has set?
Well, I guess it all starts with people, and I can say now I'm facing young people of the Pacific. I mean, I take it, I will throw it as a challenge upon you. Why don't you start mobilizing your forces, connect, bring up a petition and connect with other young people who are like-minded, who believe in supporting the cause of the Pacific Island people. I'm talking about young people, NGO groups, social groups, social organization group, young people, and I will put it on you because we're now, talking together with young people. So I will throw that ball to you, and you can sort of mobilize it, connect with other young people, draw up petitions, go into the media, social media, and then eventually, hopefully, it will catch, it will go into wildfire around there in the Pacific at the higher level, going to the government level. Churches are also very powerful. I know the churches in the Pacific are still powerful. So why don't we can push it through the church leaders, in the different faith groups in the region. That would also be very, and then the leaders of our region, and then here in New York. I mean, we are here to always take on what our leaders say, from individually or collectively, but more powerful when it comes as a group of leaders from the Pacific talking to the UN through us as their representatives. And then, of course, Japan will have to listen. Japan, who's in control of this issue, I'm sure they will have to listen. Here in the UN, if you want to be popular, if you want to always get elected into these positions, a very privileged position in the United Nations, you'll have to do the right thing. If you don't, you won't get a vote. And so we can agree here to say, if you don't agree with us, sorry, we're not going to look at your candidate. We're going to look at other candidates in whatever positions are being contested here in the United States. It's like politics, back home also in your national level. If you want to achieve certain targets of your leadership, you got to be popular with those who will be voting for you. Otherwise, you will never get there. So this is how it works also at the United Nations there. So I would say start the ball rolling there and then move it forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And given, I can see some similar questions coming again, and this is now directed to Marie. Marie, given your own experience and you shared with us some of the things that you are planning to do, the city march, and you're inviting young people, given your own work around with the people of Japan, those concerned groups, and the video, of course, you shared with us, what are some of the things some other things that you would like to share with us that you are planning to do to sort of delay this timeline that Japan has already set to release the water? Over to you, Marie.
Thank you so much. That's an excellent question. I don't know whether we'll be able to slow down the timeline, but we also have opposition voices, strong opposition voices from Fukushima and from Japan. So we are reaching out to our friends in Japan as well, so that we'll be able to do this global action on October 2nd or someday in October, to express our solidarity against Japan's plan to dump contaminated water into the Pacific. Some groups in United States showed interest in doing action. So it'll be wonderful if your groups could organize similar action in the Pacific. We can also continue reaching out to our friends in different countries and work together. So if you have any suggestions, comments, please reach out to me so that we can perhaps organize a strategy meeting in the future and share our tactics or strategies or ideas so that we can organize a global action against this plan.
Thank you very much, Marie, for that. And our next question comes from a 17-year-old, all the way from Fiji. And perhaps Dr. Hughes can take this, or any of our speakers who spoke today, is that why is Japan dumping the nuclear waste or the contaminated water in the Pacific Ocean? And why not in the Arctic or somewhere else? Or why not in the Tokyo River? Any takers, speakers?
I mean, I'll try, and then perhaps Marie and others can chime in as well. I think the question of why not in Tokyo is an excellent question, and it's exactly the question that should be asked, because if in fact it is safe and whatever levels are going to end up in wherever they go, are not going to be harmful, then it shouldn't matter where it goes. I think really ultimately, and I think this is a really good reminder of why nuclear weapons are so dangerous, why what happened with the nuclear testing over the many decades during the Cold War was just such an atrocity and injustice, and why even nuclear power, as promising as it was at one point in time, and I even have some colleagues who really believe that nuclear power is key to addressing climate change. So it sort of becomes this, a hot topic of discussion. The fundamental problem is that when you have these isotopes that are harmful to human health, that are harmful to the environment, They don't just go away. There's no, there's no easy way to even with nuclear energy, when you're just talking about the regular use of this stuff, there's the waste that gets generated, and the question, and that's without an accident like, really tragedy is a better word for what happened in Fukushima. Without anything abnormal happening, you're still left with the waste. And the question still is where that waste needs to go and how it remains safe for thousands of years, for hundreds of thousands of years, because that radioactivity doesn't just go away on its own. And again, in the case of some isotopes like plutonium, it is there for so long. And so, I think that's exactly, why not in Tokyo? Why not here in New York? Why not, that's exactly the kind of question we should be asking. Where does it go? And it's also the question of why did these nuclear tests happen where they did? The easy answer was, oh, it was remote, it was far away, not too many people lived there. But that's not good enough, right? And we have to do better. And people like Ambassador Cito inspire us to do better, to make the world a better place. We have to keep asking those questions. So that's an excellent question.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes. I see Marie has something to say as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a really good question. First of all, we need to acknowledge the fact that Fukushima, what's going on in Fukushima is another form of nuclear colonialism, because Fukushima is a rural community away from Tokyo, and they picked this site because less people live there and their voices are not heard in Tokyo. So when United States and Japan promoted nuclear energy in Japan, they picked this site, not Tokyo. They said that everything is safe, nuclear energy, peaceful use of nuclear energy, and peaceful use of nuclear is safe and not dangerous, but actually it was not. So that's something that we need to continue conveying that message to nuclear disarmament community, because I have seen many groups working on abolishing nuclear weapons, but intentionally silent about nuclear energy and related issues, which is heartbreaking, because what's going on in Fukushima is a slow motion of nuclear war, in a sense that they are dealing with the ongoing radioactive contamination. So that's something that I wanted to share. And we have this UN international organization called the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency. In the United States and Japan, they're trying to promote nuclear energy. So in order to do so, they need to continue sharing this message that our nuclear is safe. And that's why they covering up and downplaying the impact of Fukushima. So we have to say that is not true. So it's not just about Fukushima disaster, but it's about how we change the narrative surrounding the nuclear energy and the issues associated with it.
Thank you.
And if I can just add, if I can just build on something Marie said about the IAEA, it's really, really important to recognize that this organization was founded to promote the use of nuclear energy. And many times, even when it comes to the nuclear legacy, there have been IAEA reports on sort of the nuclear legacy of various locations, and there are things in those reports that are of questionable nature. I'll just say one thing I mentioned in a couple of moments. I mentioned the Cesium-137, which is a particular isotope that ends up in the food. IAEA has a limit on the amount of cesium-137 that's allowed in food. It just happens to be a number that's 1,000 becquerels per kilogram. When Japan set their own limit after Fukushima, they set it at 100 becquerels per kilogram. And countries affected by the Chernobyl disaster set it even lower than that. It's something about 40 becquerels per kilogram. The United States is the only one that outdoes IAEA and sets the limit at 1,200 becquerels per kilogram. So again, if you don't know anything, you just understand that 100 is different from 1,000, and then 1,200 is even higher than that. My point is just that, you know, asking IAEA about is nuclear energy safe is kind of like, you know, asking, I don't know, a tradesman, is your product good? You know, they're going to tell you it is. Because that's their job, and it is their job to promote nuclear energy.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes. I have around 20 more questions on the box, but of course, we will have to let you sleep, Ambassador Sito, too. I know it's very late there. And so why not conclude on this point with inviting Ambassador Sito, given that these are the same thematic questions coming up. And now, Ambassador Sito, the floor has been passed back to you by these young people who are asking, you have given us a challenge, and these young people are saying, we will take this challenge forward, we will start rolling the ball from our end. But we have just heard that why not, if it's safe, if the water is safe, why not release it in Tokyo? Why not release it in the Arctic? Who will oppose to that? So these people, these young people, and we are asking from the chat box, I can see that there's a lot of chatter going on, is that what can you do and your fellow colleagues, fellow ambassadors of the Pacific can do to convince Japan to release the water elsewhere? And we'll conclude with that. Ambassador, over to you.
Yes, I guess it can be quite simple. It can be very complicated for us to try and change the minds of the Japanese government and authorities in relation to this. But it's something that we can, you know, if we are serious here as Pacific ambassadors, we can actually do something about it. You know, it means coming together. Is coming together as ambassadors and talk with the Japanese ambassador to express the concerns that we now hear from our young people, and we can use, you know, we can refer to our discussion tonight. If we have copies of what is happening tonight, maybe Christian can work on something that can be a mandate for our Pacific ambassadors here to work on, and then to move it forward. Put it on the table of the Japanese ambassador here. He's very friendly to us, always contact each other, but and so we can do something like that. How they receive it is just something else I cannot predict, but I hope that they will take it seriously if it does come from the ambassadors of the Pacific working together in unity and in solidarity. So that would be my my answer to that question. I can also inform you that that recently there was a conference of state parties on the law of the sea, and I happened to be there, and I was listening towards the end, where we had a number of countries raising the concern at the end of that meeting, asking over this particular issue and asking the Japanese authorities to think again and to make sure that what they do in dumping into the ocean is not something that they will do alone, in isolation or in secret. They must, make it everything transparent to the member states of the United Nations. And I heard the ambassador for Japan speaking, or the representative of Japan speaking at that conference, saying, initially they were saying it's safe, it's safe, it's safe, but then the other side kept coming up. I think it was Korea and I think China and others saying, but we're not sure. How do you say it's safe? You cannot say it's safe just because you're there watching what's going on. we need to see it. We need to see evidence that it is safe. And so, yeah, I heard that they were, Japan then kind of changed its stand a bit and say, okay, I agree. We will have to make everything transparent. So there is always this conversation going on. I don't know how far it's gone, but it appears that maybe they will go ahead in dumping it, and whether the other member states are happy with what is going to be done, that is something that we can certainly take up in the days to come.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for that comment and for that insight. We have gone a bit over time by 6 minutes, of course, but I have noted the questions. We have noted the questions. We will try, build something up next on those lines. And given the number of questions that has been posed also in the chat box, I can see that there's a lot of interesting dialogue that can happen with the young people across the Pacific. Marie, would you like to add something before I conclude?
Yes, I forgot to mention that Japanese civil society groups made a couple of suggestions as an alternative to releasing. One of them is building a large tank, which is already used by the petrochemistry industry. So it's an existing technology, it has been used for years, and that could be built in Fukushima Daiichi site instead of storing in the small tanks. There are other suggestions as well, and they've been sharing these suggestions to Japanese government for the past years, but these suggestions were not heard by the government. I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Marie. And with those words, we will conclude. Of course, Christian, sorry, would you like to say something?
No worries. I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And this is really start of further dialogue, and just to let everyone know that the Pacific youth, especially those who are part of RTT, will be working on a youth declaration, which will be presented soon. Back to you, Anit.
Thank you, Christian. Yes, of course, given the interaction we have had today with the speakers, also the chat box is flooded. I'm sure we have a lot to take back, and I'm sincerely thanking all the attendees, the young people who have joined us today, who are listening in today, that surely we will continue these dialogues. A big thank you to all our speakers for this event, passing on our gratitude to our sponsors and partners, as well as the attendees today. Thank you so much for joining us. I see that youths from across the Blue Pacific joined us for this important event, and much appreciation to our Pacific Youth Working Committee group for putting this event together. Before I officially close and we invite our speakers in the Youth Working Committee to take a picture or take a screenshot with us, let me just sum up in a minute, and I've been trying my best to write this down and note whatever the speakers are saying. In just a minute, let me sum up today's interaction. The Pacific states have gradually succeeded in pushing climate change to the forefront of the regional security narrative and the paradigm, where it is now defined both as an existential threat and as a threat multiplier. But with today's conference and all that we have learned, it is excavating, amongst other things, the damage and risk caused by nuclear waste and adversely impacting fisheries and agriculture, and thus our food security and our Blue Pacific Ocean as a whole. We have been talking so much about building a resilient Blue Pacific, but we must now be critically thinking and with urgency as to how this over 1 million tons of contaminated water being discharged in our ocean is going to affect our people, places, and prospects. We must not let this happen at any cost, and we must call for international consultations, international law, and independent and verifiable scientific assessments and guidance on this matter before any discharge of the contaminated water is discharged in our Blue Pacific Ocean. We hope to keep these dialogues going on with you through the RTT Pacific branch, and we will continue to build upon youth partnerships, cross-border partnerships, global partnerships, so that this action, this youth action, can proceed further, and we can somehow impact and prevent the enormous amount of contaminated water into our Blue Pacific Ocean. Like one of our speakers said, the Pacific Ocean is our heart. So let's prevent our hearts being poured with contaminated water. With those words, I now officially close off this conference session, and we look forward to engaging with you all in very near future through this. Now invite all